we do get on to today's topic, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our Thought Leaders Forum. At ASI, as most of you know, we have been working for over 3 decades at the forefront of some of the most complex challenges in conflict, stability and peace building globally. And these Thought Leaders Forum sessions are our ongoing commitment to create spaces where we can hear from a range of experts and have insightful conversations about subjects that matter, fostering collaboration and driving innovation in international development. Today's topic, the economies that fuel war, is critical to that understanding. During conflict, many livelihoods are destroyed, leaving large swathes of the population impoverished. However, in that context, some do profit greatly. A range of actors will step in, taking advantage of a breakdown in political and social norms and in the rule of law. We are really fortunate to have an esteemed panel of experts with us here today, each shining a light on different aspects of war economies. A really warm welcome to them. Professor Jonathan Goodhand will take us through his research on drug economies in conflict zones like Afghanistan, Myanmar and Colombia. Dr. Orly Stern will talk to the gendered dimensions of war economies. How are women involved in war economies as perpetrators, collaborators and victims? And Michael Jones will offer insights on how violent extremist organisations such as Al-Shabaab exploit and shape these war economies, further fueling conflict. And today's discussion will be moderated by Kathleen Valentini, ASI Senior Manager in our Governance and Stability team. We're really fortunate to have a diverse audience today from policymakers, academics, practitioners, students, and those just interested in knowing more about this topic. And so after the panel discussion, please do join in the discussion, share your thoughts, ask questions. Once again, thank you all for joining. For those of you in London, after the discussion, we will have drinks and refreshments. So please do stay for that. Now I'll hand over to Kathleen. Thank you.
Jalpa, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and a warm welcome from me also to those here in the room, but also online. So our panel today will be divided into 2 parts. The first 45 minutes will be presentations by our panelists here today, followed by a question and answer session that will also last about 45 minutes. Through my own personal and professional background working with the EU, NATO and now ASI, I have seen how, in modern conflicts, the line between fighting and crime blur. I have worked on projects aimed at countering the financing of terrorism and experienced firsthand how difficult it can be to develop approaches in conflict states where programming does not impact the livelihood of parts of the population, reliant on the shadow economy for survival. Therefore, I was really excited when I was actually asked to moderate this panel, War Economies, because it allowed me to delve a little deeper into the topic. In preparation for the event, I looked at online articles and books, and I discovered that the topic is addressed by many scholars as part of wider analysis on drivers of conflict, serious organized crime, and terrorism. Some individuals here today, in the room and online, may have contributed to that vast body of literature. I was surprised, however, to discover that it wasn't as explored as I had imagined as a standalone topic, or that even parts and aspects of war economies weren't necessarily delved into in any depth. So we are here today because war economies is a topic which deserves more traction. So before starting, I wanted to talk about terminology. The term war economy is often used to describe the relationships between governments, markets, and businesses associated with the mobilization of resources to either prepare for war or in times of war. However, throughout this panel, we will use the term war economies to denote something else. This will be to denote a phenomenon in which parties to a conflict engage in large-scale illicit enterprises, the exploitation of resources, the levy of taxes, and the control of trade routes to generate the funds necessary to continue their operations and also benefit from them, enriching themselves or their members. This means we will be looking mainly at armed actors, but both state and non-state, and we will also understand war to mean conflict, both the active ones, but also those conflicts that have not seen sustained direct combat in years, so low simmering conflicts. Our panelists, that I will be introducing in more details very shortly, will each address the topic under a different lens. So as was mentioned by our CIO Jalpa in her opening remarks, one of our panelists will be looking at it geographically, so focusing on a particular country. One of our panelists will be focusing by industry, looking at drug economies. And one of our panelists will be looking at it through a gender lens. So really excited to be sort of looking at all of these different aspects. In terms of our panelists, we are joined today by Professor Jonathan Goodhand, who's a professor in conflict and development studies at SOAS University. He's an FCDO UCRI Senior Research Fellow and an Honorary Professional Fellow in the School of Social and Political Science of the University of Melbourne. He has led several large research projects and published extensively on the political economy of armed conflict, conflict in borderlands, stabilization, peace-building processes, with a particular focus on South and Central Asia. He has also worked with and advised policymakers and organizations on conflict, security, and peace-building related issues, including the FCDO, the World Bank, the ILO, and a range of NGOs. He has also worked, prior to becoming an academic, for several NGOs in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Central Asia. Dr. Orly Stern is a researcher, consultant, and international lawyer who focuses on armed conflict, gender security, and law. Orly has worked and researched in countries including Somalia, Iraq, northern Nigeria, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, and Central African Republic. She has consulted for various international organizations, including ASI, where she has been one of our top consultants working on key projects in the Horn of Africa. Orly holds a PhD in international humanitarian law from the London School of Economics, for which she conducted a feminist critique of international humanitarian law. She has served as a visiting fellow of practice with the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, Oxford University, and you have held senior fellowship with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. She has taught international criminal law at the University of Cape Town, and her upcoming book on women and war economies will be discussed at this event, and so we very much look forward to its publication next year. Michael Jones is a research fellow in the terrorism and conflict team at RUSI, where he examines political violence, non-state armed groups, and the convergence of violent extremism and insurgent militancy in East and Sub-Saharan Africa. In 2008, Michael was selected as a member of the Commonwealth CVE panel of experts, and as of 2023, he leads the research and violence monitoring component of the UK's Reinvent programme, addressing insecurity in Kenya, and he continues to analyse relationships between conflict, organised crime, and the wider political economies of Kenya and Nigeria. Michael has also worked as a consultant, analysing peacekeeping in Somalia and corruption in Sudan. So I would like to thank everyone here in welcoming our panelists, and we will start with Jonathan. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I thought I was second, but I'm happy to start first. But I start off. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a really interesting panel. And I want to start by congratulating Orly on the new book. And there is a vast and ever-growing literature on war economies, but I think Orly's book, which highlights the gender dimension of these processes, is really, she's addressing a real gap in that literature. So well done. I really look forward to reading the book, because I'm sure I'll learn a lot from doing it, and it's overdue. So my comments today are going to be based primarily, but not exclusively, on my own research, and mainly on a research program that I've been leading over the last 4 years. It's just finished, called Drugs and Disorder. And the overarching question we were asking ourselves in this project was, how do war economies become peace economies? Focus in particular on the role of illicit drugs, and we did research over 4 years in 9 different borderland regions of Afghanistan, Colombia and Myanmar. And also to say that our work was not only looking at war economies in terms of like armed actors, we were looking at it as a kind of societal kind of set of questions, and particularly how communities in borderland regions were engaging with war economies, coping with them and sometimes profiting from them. So the 2 things I'm going to focus on today in the short time I've got is one, the challenge of how we talk about and unpack and problematize and analyze this thing that we call war economies. And I would just say a few vignettes from this, because it's a very big question, of course. The second thing I want to very briefly touch on is about how a war economy is different from peace economies, and also how they may be related and maybe even co-produce each other. So the first thing on unpacking war economies, a kind of schema that I developed many years ago that we still find useful in our work, the latest project, is dividing up war economies into a combat economy, a shadow economy and a coping economy. What do we mean by this? Well, a combat economy is essentially the raising of revenues and the distribution of revenues in order to prosecute wartime goals, to pursue wartime goals, buying weapons, supplying your troops, and so on and so on. Secondly, a shadow economy are regimes of accumulation in which wartime entrepreneurs and profiteers make a profit out of war. Certain classes, certain elites do well out of war. It doesn't mean to say that they're pro-war. If they can make a profit in peacetime, then they'll be pro-peace. So they're different from those involved in the combat economy. And thirdly, there's the majority of the population are basically coping. They're not doing well out of war. They're trying to survive. They're trying to spread risk. They're trying to manage a very precarious situation by kind of, spreading risks, whether it's growing poppy, whether it's sending people across the border as migrants, whether it's getting them to join armed groups and so on. And when we think about this schema, we're thinking about, well, who are involved in these different economies, what commodities are involved in them, and how do they intersect? Poppy, heroin or coca, they're involved in all 3. Coca is something that is used to raise revenues. It's something that, particularly if you're involved in the trade, you can get a profit from, but it's also central to people's livelihoods and how they cope in wartime situations. And we find it's a useful schema to think about different motivations, different sets of incentives, and different sets of dynamics, and how they change and they're constantly in flux. So, for example, revenues from drugs, they provide and they can provide the tax base for rebellion. But at the same time, we found in many areas where we've been doing research, they provide rents which are distributed amongst elites to build stable political coalitions and bring about a level of order. So it's not necessarily the fact that these illicit economies are generating conflict. They may be actually being an investment in sets of kind of political settlements that build order. So, for example, in the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan in the late 1990s, this is when the drug trade expanded massively, but it's also one of the most peaceful times in recent Afghan history in terms of level of order. Secondly, just another vignette from coca, from Colombia and coca production, which we found that coca was actually central to people's coping strategies. That coca cultivation provided the peasantry with a foothold on the land. It was a bulwark for people who had been squeezed out of the formal illicit economy. So it enabled precarious peasantries to deal with what we call the so-called reproduction squeeze, to manage to reproduce themselves, to manage to make a living under these kinds of precarious situations. At the same time, we shouldn't idealize coca. There are some tough trade-offs. People talked about how it was also associated with high levels of violence. On the other hand, they also talked about how the illicit economy was also linked to very high levels of violence. Mining and ranching were associated with paramilitaries and a lot of violence as well. So David Keane talks about how we shouldn't overly demonize war and romanticize peace when we're thinking about war economies and peace economies. We also found that there's no fixed relationship between illicit drugs and their effects. It varies across space and time. So whereas in Colombia we found that there were these kind of positive benefits in terms of providing a safety net. In Myanmar, where there's high levels of drug use in the borderlands of Shan State and Myanmar, we find also that the growing drug use, particularly of yaba, of methamphetamines or heroin, was having a very major impact on intra and interfamily relations, affecting gender relations in a profound way. A lot of drug users were young women. And one of the responses was a major movement in which women were a key protagonist in, called Pachasan, which was an anti-drug movement and deployed kind of ways of trying to address drugs which diverged very markedly from what we might think of international best practice in terms of harm reduction. But it was a response by women to a situation they found themselves in. So I think to finish off this kind of first point about unpacking drug economies, what it shows is we need to de-fetishize drugs, but also other commodities, and not just treat them as kind of a resource which is a conflict good. They are embedded in social relations, and we need to understand those social relations to understand what impact and role those commodities, whether they're illicit or illicit, have on conflict dynamics. Now, the second point the second question I wanted to address is about war economies and peace economies, and what is the relationship between them. I mean, firstly, there's a kind of temporal relationship. How does a war economy become a peace economy over time? What kinds of processes and dynamics lead to take the violence out of the economy, to build a sustainable political economy of peace? I'm not going to give a pithy answer to that because I don't have a pithy answer to that. But I think one thing that our work showed, our longitudinal research shows, are the complexities around this transition. And it's certainly not linear, it's certainly not a peaceful and smooth transition. And often a political economy of war can mutate into a criminalized political economy of peace. And also, there's an important spatial dimension to this. On the margins of the state, which are often the centers of illicit economies, in Colombia and Myanmar, for example, for many people, these notional transitions from war to peace made life more precarious and more violent, in spite of the signing of peace accords, which brought down the levels of large-scale armed violence. So there's a transmutation into other forms of violence. Paramilitaries in Colombia coming in to fill the vacuum left with FARC, the growth of organised crime. In Myanmar, the signing of ceasefire agreements opened up the border regions to investments from commercial firms, to kind of mining contractors, to the building of pipelines, and what's been called ceasefire capitalism. And this was associated with very violent processes of dispossession, and the marginalization of borderland populations as kind of commercial extractive forms of development came in as a result of the ceasefires. And associated with this was also the growth of the drug economy, not its decline. The growth of drug use, the growth of drug cultivation, as people were pushed off the land, and also as the kind of the labor regimes around mining were often linked to payment in yaba, in methamphetamines. And so the thing to think about here in these transitions from war to peace are their major transition costs, and we need to think about what those distribution of costs are. In the borderland regions we were looking at, the costs of these waterband transitions were primarily, overwhelmingly borne by people living on the margins. So there's a need to rethink the standard template for addressing war economies, which is about integrating the margins, building, rolling out development and investment, and state building in these peripheries, which didn't lead to peace dividends for people who lived on these peripheral areas, and they didn't address the underlying drivers of war economies. Okay, the final point which is about the kind of spatial dimension of the link between war economies and peace economies. So we've known for a long time that war economies are regional and global in their dimensions, and Caroline Nordstrom wrote about this many years ago. There's a recent really outstanding book by somebody called Peter Schutten called Roadblock Politics, and focusing on the Central African Republic. And he talks about how Heineken beer found its way in a kind of capillary type motion, following kind of back roads, going across roadblocks, finding its way into the remote corners of the Central African Republic. And how this was linked to a very opaque and complex set of supply chain kind of relationships involving multinational companies, local level consultancy firms, and armed groups manning the checkpoints. And similarly, we've known this for many years in Afghanistan. The study of Warlord, it's called Warlord Inc., many years ago, was looking at how NATO forces and the supply chains managed the flows of logistics of support from Pakistan into the forward operating bases of Afghanistan through these sets of multiple consultancy groups, brokering arrangements, local warlords, and even paying off Taliban along the way. So war economies are deeply entangled in global supply chains. This is something that's well documented and we know. But what if there's actually a very symbiotic relationship between metropolitan centres and these supposedly remote and rural borderland regions? What if they're co-producing each other? What if the metropolitan centres and the development that's taking place in those areas relies upon these kinds of processes? So in a new project that we're about to start, we're trying to explore these linkages between the movement of capital, of commodities and people between unruly borderlands and metropolitan centres. So how, for example, are the processes we see in Shan and Kachin states of Myanmar, where there's rare earth extraction, jade mining, drug production, transnational organised crime, how are these linked to processes of development in urban centres like Kunming, the other side of the border? How, for example, are the poppy fields, at least that were in Nangarhar, linked to the shopping malls and the big infrastructure and investments in Dubai? We aim to explore in this study how conflict-affected borderlands are connected to development processes and wealth accumulation in metropolitan centres. And our starting point, our hypothesis to begin this research, is that concentrations of violence, environmental stress and poverty and illicit activities in borderlands are a result of how these regions have been integrated into national, regional and global political economies, rather than their lack of integration. What we're interested in is a varieties of what we call adverse incorporation. So from the perspective of the metropole, regional violence and disintegration of nearby states may present economic opportunities that can be catalysed and exploited, rather than problems to be contained and solved. So the accumulated profits from the Afghan war economy feed into Dubai's peace economy with its urban developments and associated financial infrastructures. Many years ago, it was said during the era of slavery that behind Manchester stood Mississippi. Perhaps it's a bit exaggerating to say this, but to some extent, behind the shopping malls of Dubai and the luxury developments stand the poppy fields of Nangarhar. So the margins that are produced as spaces in which development needs are, the margins then are produced as spaces in which the development needs of urban centres are secured, often with violence, through new forms of resource politics, infrastructure, the creation of reserve labour forces, and the opening up of new frontiers for licit and illicit capital accumulation that's reinvested elsewhere. So there's a need to think more systematically about how war economies out there are connected to so-called peace economies here, and the forms of adverse incorporation and brokerage that connect them. And I think in the long run, tracing and better understanding these connections and how they produce combined but uneven forms of development may be key to more effective policy responses that can help transform war economies into peace economies.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I already have here several questions linked to those implications, I think, for policymakers, but also for companies such as the ASI, who are implementing on behalf of governments and international organizations some programming in conflict-affected countries. Dr. Orly Stern, if you want to go next.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you for the opportunity to present this research. So I've been working on a book project for the last 3 years that looks at women in war economies, and I wanted to give you a taste of the findings from this project today. So, as you all know, a body of scholarship has developed around war economies over the past years. But if you look at the scholarship, you'll see that the scholarship's largely gender blind. It looks at people as people. And if you dig a little further, what you're really looking at when you're looking at war economies is often the actions of men. The literature would imply that war economies has a primarily male cast of characters. And I found myself wondering, where do women fall into this picture? Are women actually actors in war economies? How do women interact with war economies? How do women fall into this picture? And so I started exploring this, and that's what I want to present to you today. The way that I did this in my book was I looked at war economies by looking at some component trades within them. I looked at a number of industries that one commonly finds popping up in different war economy contexts around the world. I looked at the extractive sector, natural resource extraction. I looked at the drug economies as part of war economies. I looked at kidnapping for ransom. I looked at cross-border trade and smuggling, and I looked at a few different industries. And for each one, I asked the question, how do women fit into this? Are women actors? Are women victimized? How do women interact by these? How are women impacted by these? And so each chapter creates a vignette of these different industries, talking about how these industries fit in within the broader picture of war economies, and then where women fit into this picture. And so what I'd like to do today, very, very briefly, is take you through, hopefully, if I have time, 4 little vignettes, or 4 little industries that one finds in war economies, for each one giving you just a bit of a flavor of where women fit into this. My talk will be very, very top level, so if you want more of a flavor and more detail, please read my book when it comes out, but I'll just give you a highlight today. And also to say, I'm not necessarily talking about the main war economy industries, the main things that form part of these, but I'm picking a few that I thought had interesting female participation and involvement, which really give a flavor of this. And then I'll end off my talk by bringing it together and just looking for some top-level findings of what does this tell us about war economies? What do these explorations of women's roles teach us that we may not have known if we weren't looking for women? So let me start off with kidnapping for ransom. That's an industry that one finds frequently popping up as part of war economies, and a number of war economy actors have made quite significant amount of money through kidnapping for ransom. You've seen this particularly with lots of groups which are Islamic terrorism group, which are also conflict actors, and in certain parts of the world, they've made significant funds which have been used to fund insurgencies to buy weapons. And so I thought this was a very interesting industry to be part of this. Now, where do women come into this? Often when we think about kidnappers for ransom, we think about men abducting people, holding them, ransoming them. And certainly with the well-known war economy groups that have engaged in this, we often really only see the male characters. Where do women come into this? And what I found is that women actually play very interesting roles in the perpetration of kidnapping for ransom. While you do in fact have men often taking people, doing the violent act, stealing people, what you often find is that women are involved in caring for these people after the fact. Hostages are taken, they're kept somewhere, and then it's often women who used to feed them, to give them accommodation, to care for them. Women often provide medical care. Women play the role of keeping these people alive in a form of commodified care. And this makes sense because often it falls to women to conduct care roles in society. So what you see is a mirroring of women's societal roles. And I found the same type of commodified care coming up in other industries, smuggling of migrants, human trafficking. It was often women who played these sorts of care roles. There were other roles that women played as well. Really interesting example, when I was reading about the kidnapping that forms part of Somali piracy, you saw women being responsible for resource procurement. So when you're doing a massive kidnapping or piracy operation, there's a lot of goods that you need. You need food, you need guns, you need various different goods. Women are often used to buy these goods. In a place like Somalia, if a man went to a shop and said, I'd like to buy a really large quantity of food and things like that, this would raise suspicion. The Somalia authorities are on the lookout for men doing these sorts of things. And so they send women to procure the goods that they need. Women in Somalia often shop for large families and large events, and so it doesn't attract any attention. And so once again, you have this thing of women playing roles for war economy industries, which mirrors the roles that they play back home. Kidnapping for ransom is also very gendered for victims. It's a highly gendered industry. Gender affects the chances of somebody being kidnapped, and it shapes the way their experiences once they are kidnapped. So many more men are kidnapped for ransom, both local men and foreign men. Much fewer women are kidnapped. There's reasons for all of this, but for foreign women specifically, one of the reasons that you have less women kidnapped for ransom is that there's less women working in the sorts of places where these actors operate. There'll just be less women deployed in these places. But also, an interviewer of mine told me that kidnapping groups don't really like kidnapping women. They say women are a hassle to keep alive. They're much more work. There's much more complicated logistically. They're harder to move around. They attract way more media attention. And so there's an expert told me that there's definitely a feeling amongst kidnappers that let's not go there. It's really, really complicated. Another thing I'll finally say about the gendered experience of being kidnapped is that women suffer very differently to men in certain ways. And one of the main ways that women suffer in this, as we'll see in many of the industries, is through sexual violence. One of the things that's common to the experiences of female victims of kidnapping for ransom is sexual violence. And in some parts of the world, that's very common. In other parts of the world, they realize that their role is to protect the asset. And so that features less. And so I thought that was a really interesting gendered difference. Moving on to a different industry, I'm not sure if you can really call it an industry, but I had a chapter that looked at forced labor, human trafficking, and slavery as part of war economies, and because I thought that had a really interesting gendered component. Sometimes women are sold in war economies, much like other resources are sold. And in fact, sometimes you have groups who are engaging in trafficking other types of goods. And then what they'll realize is that there's actually a really lucrative industry of women right there as well. And so they'll add women to their trades, often utilizing the same networks, the same transport routes, the same people that they need to bribe that they did for the other resources. So women just become an additional resource that's sold. I looked at forced labor by war economy actors, and it's well documented that forced labor often forms a really important part of war economy trades. We've seen many groups in the DRC relying on forced kidnapped labor to man the mines in the DRC. The RUF in Sierra Leone were very famous to have taken lots of civilians captive and made them work in the diamond mines. And so it's well established that forced labor is really an important part of a war economy picture in certain places. But that's got a really interesting gendered picture too. And so when I looked a little bit to try and understand where this came in, I looked through certain examples, and I'll give you one of the examples now. The RUF, the Revolutionary United Front, I think it is, in Sierra Leone, it abducted huge amounts of civilians for many different things, including farming, including mine work, and they utilized them men and women in quite different ways. So for mining, you had many more men taken. Men in Sierra Leone traditionally do the mining, and so many more men were abducted for mining work. When men were abducted, they often took their wives at the same time, and they used their wives for other things, such as domestic work, such as sex slaves and other tasks like that. So you saw families being split in that way. Agriculture in Sierra Leone is split between men and women traditionally. Both men and women farm. And so what you saw was the RUF taking men and women both for agriculture, and both being used in that way. Although in Sierra Leone, women do a certain fishing for fish called talpia, and so women were used for talpia and men were used for other things. And so, again, what you saw was armed groups' use of women mirroring the way in which women in society did the same things, which I thought was quite an interesting thing to see. It's well documented that armed groups abduct women. They take them to their group to serve the groups in domestic roles and in running armed groups, in both serving armed group spaces and helping their operations to function. And I thought it was very important to look at this. Women often play domestic roles for armed groups. And often we discount the value of domestic roles. We don't look at that as an economic thing. We don't look at that as something with economic value. And I think that that's a real mistake, because the roles that women play for armed groups, the domestic roles that they play, are massively important, and they're a really valuable asset. If women were not carrying out these roles, cleaning and cooking and fetching water, then men would have to. Then armed group men would have to. And so there's an intrinsic economic value in the domestic labor that one finds, and this is often done by women, often who are forced by armed groups to carry out this labor. So another trade which is really important in war economies is cross-border trade. You know, in war economies, a lot of goods need to be carried over the border. Many of the other assets and resources that are exploited in war economies cross borders to do this. But equally important in insurgencies is that goods need to come in to keep populations going, to keep armed groups going, to keep war economies actors going. None of these things could keep on going without the goods that needed to make that happen. And again, in many parts of the world, women play the primary role in cross-border trade. I think the statistic is that 70% of informal cross-border trade in the world is carried out by women. And so once again, you see the same thing happening in war economies. You see women carrying out cross-border trade for armed actors and for war economy actors. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. In Sierra Leone, in Somalia, Al-Shabaab deploys women frequently to trade goods for them over the borders. So women are deployed by Al-Shabaab to go from Al-Shabaab territory into government-held territory, and also to trade in neighboring countries, including Kenya, Ethiopia, and the Somaliland region of Somalia. And you see women going out to the regions, going up to the cities and bringing back goods which are utilized by Al-Shabaab, and they're also utilized to keep the population of Al-Shabaab territory going. Women are also involved in cross-border trade for Al-Shabaab's criminal activities. So one of the challenges that Al-Shabaab has is in laundering cash, is in moving money. Because there have been a number of restrictions that have been put on Al-Shabaab through the banking systems, and so Al-Shabaab struggles to move money. So one of the ways that they do this is they'll send women over the border, women buy goods, and then carry them over the border and sell the goods on the other side as one of the methods by which Al-Shabaab uses to launder money. So anyway, I was going to tell you about women in the extractive sector, but I'll leave that for the question and answer session if there's any questions. But let me just talk about a few conclusions. What do we learn from this? So I think one of the things that we can see from this is that women are in fact involved in war economies. They're there, but they often play different roles to men. And I think for me what was really interesting is to see that women's roles are often, first of all, shaped by culture. They're shaped by the sorts of things that are culturally deemed appropriate for women to do. And second of all, women's roles often mirror the types of roles that women play in everyday life in those societies. So you don't have women playing altogether different roles in war economies. Rather, you've got them playing regular roles within war economy criminal trades. Women, from what I can see, seldom play leadership roles. They're often relegated to the lower level tiers of various different industries, much as women seldom play high-level roles in insurgencies and in armed groups in these sorts of places. They're often relegated to the lower tiers, even if they're involved in armed groups. Women themselves don't seem to carry out violent acts, even though there's often violent acts very much intrinsic in war economies. Women often take part in these industries and they know these violent acts are happening, but they themselves seldom carry out the roles. Those sorts of roles are often held by women. So what I can see is that where women are involved in war economy trades, they're often involved at the very, very lowest level of war economy trades, in that place where participation really blends with victimization. And even if they are carrying out an active role in war economy trades, they're often abused badly, sexually violated badly in the process. Sadly, one of the things which was really apparent is that in every single industry that I looked at in the book, sexual violence, sexual exploitation was an absolutely patent feature in women's involvement. Whether women had sex imposed on them, whether they traded it or bartered it transactionally, whether they used it as a survival strategy, in every single industry I worked at, sexual relations were a part. So yes, that's a little brief takeaway of things that I found. I would love to tell you in much more detail about many of the fascinating industries, and I'm really excited to share the book next year, and I'm looking forward to the questions at the end.
Orly, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I have lots of questions that have popped up, at least on my side. And one that I would like probably to explore further on is that idea of, marginalized groups, going back to what Jonathan presented. So very much would like to follow up on that later. But first we'll hand over to Michael, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview of Al-Shabaab in Somalia and their impact on the war economies there.
Perfect, thank you very much. So yes, I'll speak briefly on Shabaab, given it's one of the more resilient and prolific of Al-Qaeda's franchises in Africa. using the group hopefully as a vignette to better understand how violent extremist organizations shape and are in turn shaped by war economies, and hopefully overlapping with some of the points also made by my fellow panelists. So just by way of background, Somalia still resembles what a number of academics have sort of described as a disassembled patchwork of public authorities and political entrepreneurs, with decades of conflicts leading to informal systems of adaptation and informal security provision, often along clan lines, and violent contestation over resources, real estate, and rent-seeking opportunities. Amid this backdrop, a raft of local, national, and international actors continue to benefit from unregulated, illicit trade and various other criminal activities, competing and coexisting within a predatory political marketplace, which is often set in active opposition to the idea of state building pushed so heavily by international donors. Shabab in particular has proved fairly adept at navigating these conflict dynamics since roughly around 2006, 2007. While the scope of its territory has fluctuated quite significantly over time, it still enjoys near complete control over around 20 to 30% of rural south central Somalia, running a complex pseudo-state replete with ministries, public services, and basic welfare provision. Described by Dr. Patricia Bacon as part terrorist organization, part insurgency, part shadow government, and part mafia, Shabab blends coercive security, intimidation, and rudimentary forms of civic largesse to encourage compliance with this ideological project. In this context, Sharia law has been exploited as a holistic framework for order making, allowing the group to transcend local clan divisions and supply some semblance of justice, predictability, and normality for exhausted communities. Funding this proto-state and this sort of shadow government they've developed alongside its day-to-day militant activities is therefore a significant undertaking. But the full scope of Shabab's war economy still remains fairly unclear, not least because the ill-defined networks brokering these operations vary across time and place, requiring you to distinguish quite specifically between Shabab's Somali heartlands, Kenya and Somalia's borderlands, and Kenya's more securitized interior. Empirical data also remains scarce due to the difficulty of accessing those living in Shabab-run areas. Academics like Stig Hansen and Catherine Petrich, among others, cite the risk of direct qualitative analysis becoming reliant on a Nairobi reality where the same expatriates and political leaders are sort of interviewed over and over. And recent RUSI research likewise underlines the difficulty of building up a clear picture of local perspectives and experiences in this context. Communities at the frontier of Shabab's economy are often reluctant to share their insights, given fear of retaliation or prosecution. And so this is fed into successive misconceptions or data lags around how we understand Shabab's complicity in, for example, the illicit ivory market, which was considered a major source of revenue until research by colleagues at RUSI in 2015 sort of caveated Shabab's involvement as far more opportunistic, ad hoc, and smaller in scale than previously assumed. And more recently, we see similar misconceptions or confusion over the relationship between Shabab and piracy, the role of Shabab in transnational charcoal trading, and contested understandings, as Orly's mentioned, around women's economic agency in Shabab-run areas. Broadly speaking, though, there is a fairly good research base that we can draw on. And it's clear that Shabab has developed a diversified, highly innovative financial model that relies on financial control and surveillance of cash flows. In the early days, this derived largely from external sources, so remittances from the diaspora and so on. But much of its income is now bound up with holding territory and regulating sort of arterial roads and key infrastructure, so domestic sources of revenue within its immediate control or proximity. Given the impunity and reach of the group, particularly among the southern regions of south central Somalia, this is translated into what experts have sort of dubbed a complex, highly centralized tax collection machine, one that continues to outstrip the revenue intake of federal authorities in Mogadishu. This encompasses various forms of profiteering, so the extraction of sort of fixed levies or charitable contributions on local businesses, traders, and households, alongside sort of more ad hoc payments based on administrative upkeep and Shabab's military campaigns. At the same time, Shabab imposes fees on land, crop, cattle sales, and collects in-kind payments, livestock, farm produce, etc. So systematically, essentially extorting local livelihoods across the regions it controls. Recent research, particularly from GTOC, Carbonics Accept program, ASI Thought and so on, also describes a lattice of sort of improvised checkpoints that Shabab uses to tax the transit of goods across Somalia, from food to agricultural products to contraband, and also imposing additional duties on anyone using the road system in Somalia itself. So despite losing major fundraising hubs such as Kismayo Port or Mogadishu's Bakara Market, this toll network essentially allows Shabab to continue benefiting from Somali imports and exports, sugar, concrete, cars, etc., even if it doesn't necessarily have direct access any longer to airports or port facilities. Described by GTOC as commodity agnostic, these checkpoint tariffs are usually determined by the size of the vehicle and its route, potentially explaining discrepancies between, for example, Shabab's crackdown on drug use in territories it controls, while also exploiting Somalia's role in international narcotics trafficking. Catherine Petridge, among others, argues that cocaine, heroin, and other narcotics are simply sort of taxed the same as any other cargo, with differing rates depending on the end destination. These methods are fundamentally cheap and lucrative. So several studies suggest truckers in Somalia deliberately opt to travel via Shabab checkpoints as they're considered safer, comparatively predictable, better organized than those run by either the Somali army or clan militias, and so they avoid double taxation on single journeys. And crucially, Shabab is also able to reproduce these dynamics in areas outside of its immediate control. Stig Hansen has sort of dubbed this semi-territorial control, which is extended across government-held areas, Mogadishu, Johar, other major cities, where Shabab continues to be able to extort businesses, civil society, clan elders, etc., and generate further revenue. As a result, some estimates suggest Shabab may control up to half of Somalia's domestic revenue base, affording a degree of financial self-sufficiency rarely experienced by other violent extremist organizations or insurgent groups. Crucially, the mechanics of this are still packaged as effective governance. Shabab's able to sort of crack down on any threat to its monopoly over the use of force, any sort of competition over commercial interests, essentially muscling out viable local cartels, criminal gangs, other competitors, competing extortion rackets, etc., while framing it very much as law and order. How far this extends beyond Somalia is a bit more ambiguous. Given its control over the road network in Somalia, Shabab is inevitably enmeshed in northeast Kenya's informal economy, so it taxes the exports coming over the border, basic goods, livestock, other forms of contraband, particularly as it travels from Kismayo and other major Somali cities along so-called rat lines across the closed Kenya-Somalia border, and then travels further south. But how far insurgents are really sort of entangled in then distributing commodities within Kenya itself is a bit more unclear. Further south, the form, function, and framing of Shabab activity shifts again, where you see them becoming increasingly reliant on sort of petty crime and sort of resembling more local sort of criminal outfits. And so again, you see a contrast between this sort of framing around its proto-state project in somewhere like Somalia, where predatory behavior and the sort of violent facets of its war economy are formalized as legitimate governance, and areas where it's less concerned over clear linkages between criminality and its own recruitment processes. So particularly areas outside Somalia and non-Somali communities, as several academics have noted. So this raises a couple of implications that I'll just briefly sort of glide over as we sort of look at how to best respond to Shabab's war economy. I think a lot of these findings aren't necessarily new, but they draw on extensive research from RUSI and other experts and academics, and are continually overlooked in policymaking. And so I think this is where they are worth re-emphasizing. Firstly, there does seem to be an apparent disconnect between the sort of constraints of counterterrorism and sort of conflict financing and the realities of violent extremist war economies. So if you focus on disrupting a specific commodity flow, be it sugar, be it cat, be it previously, in the case of Shabab and Somalia, charcoal, policymakers potentially missed the reality that the entire economic system in Shabab-held areas is subject to tax and extortion. Against this backdrop, applying a sort of CTF lens or financial crime regulations is impractical. The government doesn't control the territory where these transactions take place. Banks and businesses still have a direct interest in many cases collaborating with Shabab, and payment is often in kind rather than in cash. So quite a few of these limitations, I think, became evident in 2022 when the new government under President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed introduced a suite of new sort of clampdown commercial and economic measures to try to mitigate Shabab's use of the banking system, mobile money, etc., which Orly's flagged. Again, you saw a sort of displacement and an inconvenience for Shabab. It had to store and physically sort of courier cash rather than sort of transmitting it electronically. But ultimately, it still had the territory available to do that. It still had the infrastructure to do that. So ultimately, it didn't really have a sort of long-term impact, as far as we can see, on Shabab's internal financial mechanisms. And so in this context, counter-terrorist finance work needs to be linked much more readily to state-building processes, stabilization, peace building, peace dividends, and so on. These different vectors of intervention need to speak to each other much more directly. They need to be mutually reinforcing, which isn't always the case. The second key takeaway, I think, is given Shabab's ubiquity across the Somali economy, both legal and illicit, there's consequences for how far you can realistically target the financial infrastructure of the group without infringing on local coping mechanisms and survival mechanisms. And again, I think Jonathan and Orly have touched on this in a fair amount of detail. Recent research, sort of re-emphasizes the role of illicit trade over the Kenyan-Somali border. This trade is an absolute necessity for ensuring communities have viable livelihoods, they can access essential goods, and so on. So despite being technically criminalized, the trade is an otherwise scarce source of income and essentially puts food on very marginalized households' tables. Coupled with the active involvement of government functionaries and the inconsistent application of laws along the border, the boundary between licit and illicit in this context becomes increasingly blurry. At the same time, projects like Deir Swanag and others have sort of flagged how tacit collusion isn't confined to these borderland areas. You see examples of wealthy businessmen further south in Kenya paying Somali herders lump sums that not only include costs to cover corruption fees, but also Shabab checkpoint fees. So in this sense, the business communities within Kenya are often indirectly and incidentally feeding into violent extremist profiteering, while often outsourcing the risk to local middlemen and women. When you have a context where Shabab is baked into Somalia's economic system, the result is complicity, whether incidental or intentional, is widespread and difficult to isolate. The final point I'd like to flag at this stage really is that while Shabab clearly is empowered by the wider war economy in Somalia and systems of instability that feed it, I think there's also the argument to be made that Shabab could potentially be seen as vulnerable to these forces in the same way. As argued, the group supplements coercion and violence with this proto-statal project. Like other violent extremist groups, it sort of constructs and deploys what Christopher Anzalone describes as symbols and symbolic repertoires to advance political authority. In other words, they use iconography, they use the aesthetic of governance to outcompete and delegitimize their competitors. These efforts may be actively undermined if Shabab is indirectly complicit in narcotics trafficking, exploiting incidents of petty crime, becoming increasingly involved in quite localized clan conflicts over resources and so on. All of this compromises and potentially contaminates the fidelity of its ideological framework. I think this sort of hit a zenith again in 2022 when you saw Shabab trying to maximize profit at the expense of local communities. And you saw arguably an unprecedented, but if not a very unusual, level of resistance in places like Galmudug and Hirshabelle and so on, where Shabab essentially overstepped in how far it was extorting these communities resisted, and that had significant knock-on effects, not only militarily, but also financially. We had an expert at a roundtable last year who suggested that between 2022 2023, Shabab may have lost roughly around 60% of its tax income. Now, these numbers have rebounded, but it does suggest that if this sort of pretense of Shabab as a security provider is challenged sufficiently and the public lose confidence in Shabab as a security provider, then they'll be less inclined to pay, which in turn has knock-on effects for Shabab being able to maintain and fund its operations. And so again, I think this flags new untapped entry points that donors, practitioners, policymakers don't always necessarily address in a coherent way, but one that needs to be much more front and center with how we start thinking about these issues of insecurity going forward. So I'll leave it there for now, but happy to address any questions.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to our three panelists who stayed within the 15-minute limit, so great time management from everyone. Without further ado, I want to open the floor to questions, both from the people in the room here and from people online. If I can just ask everyone to remain succinct in either your questions or comments to ensure that it is, lively. We will just field one question at a time, unless we see at the end of our 30-minute Q&A session that there's too many questions and we might take them in bulk. If you want to address them to a particular member of the panel, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we can ask all three to address your question. Before I pass on the floor to Michael, I understand that there's our online audience that can't really hear the question. So I'm just going to summarize. Please bear with me if I haven't captured everything in your question. But there is a question here for Michael concerning the international community and international donors' attitude towards peace economy trade. And whether it's a little bit outdated in light of the sort of complexities in Somalia.
Yep, I mean, I can offer a brief answer, but I'm sure others will also have thoughts on this. Yeah, I mean, I think this reflects a wider issue around insufficiencies in donor approaches to insecure environments generally. I think, its approach to peace economies in Somalia, the shortfalls associated with that, reflect wider questions around what donors are actually trying to achieve in Somalia, what they realistically think is feasible within, the limited timeframes that they keep imposing, and likewise national stakeholders, how they're sort of navigating these dynamics. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this ultimately stems back to the need for different sectors of intervention to speak to each other much more readily. I think what you end up having is a lot of donors not only not coordinating with each other, but policies often siloed to such a degree that those focusing on governance and economic issues rarely speak in any meaningful way to those who are managing security issues. And I think this is, it's improved in the case of the UK, but it's still far less than it should be. So I think that has fairly substantive knock-on implications. I also think the questions around sort of sustainable livelihoods, as you were saying, for those who are demobilized, who potentially are rehabilitated, be it from Shabab or other forms of conflict actor operating in Somalia. Again, the monitoring and evaluation around these programs is so limited. The sustainability is very questionable, I think, in a lot of cases. And so you end up, with these very, very short-term fixes that I think, don't either fully address or understand the problem, or if they do, they are just overwhelmed by either lack of resourcing or, wider events. So I don't have a good prescription for it, but it is a problem that crosscuts all of these approaches.
Orly, Jonathan, do you want to add a comment to this question?
I mean, I can say a few words. I was privileged enough to actually work for a number of years on the Al-Shabaab Defectors program. And it's an absolutely fascinating program. And I interviewed many defectors from the group, and unsurprisingly, when asked why they joined, most of them, in fact, almost all of them said they joined for economic reasons. I never ever heard somebody saying they joined for ideological reasons. It always comes down to economy. The program, as with many programs, is faced with a really difficult question of like, how do we create jobs and how do we create economic opportunities in a country where the economy has been so incredibly damaged? And you know, if it's not hard enough, you know, it's hard enough to get jobs for the regular population, times that by 5 when you're dealing with people leaving an armed group. And you know, no matter how creative and well-funded a program is, that little detail of how to create jobs for people leaving a militant group in Somalia is just massive. I agree with Michael, though, that the programs weren't necessarily talking. The Defectors program wasn't talking to people looking at the war economy, wasn't talking to people looking at economic development. The work is very siloed. You know, in practice, if we siloed less, how would that work? Would that create economic opportunities and get around this problem in an incredibly tough, constrained context like Somalia? You know, of course, it's important to try, but would it be effective? I'm not sure. So yeah, I mirror your question, your frustration. It's just an incredibly hard problem to get around.
Yeah, just one point. I mean, because I don't know the context at all well, so I wouldn't pretend to have any responses to the specifics of your question. But the work we would in another set of work we did with the stabilization unit was essentially thinking about how do wars come to an end and how do situations stabilize, and the very obvious point that we made is you need a political economy and a political settlement analysis. And so there isn't some kind of economic fix. There has to be a political fix, and that involves very difficult trade-offs about how to build a sufficiently inclusive political settlement in those kinds of contexts, which will include, you know, political elites who have disruptive potential but also have terrible human rights records. And so thinking about those political trade-offs and what is inclusive enough in terms of a political settlement, to me, seems to be absolutely crucial. And development can't be the leading edge in those processes. It comes when you've got that kind of political settlement in place.
Thank you. No, I'm going to take a question from online. So there's a question for Orly, actually. You've given the audience much to think about in terms of a practitioner's focus on expanding the scope of gender context analysis for an array of strategies for addressing war economies. Based on your research findings, do you have any insights or recommendations for the anti-corruption community?
It's a great question, and it isn't a question which I've given some thought to before. But I guess, like with so many other things, work and corruption has been traditionally extremely gender blind. You know, there's a small body of writing around gender and corruption, but it's been very much on the periphery of the work. I would say that, like, my work in War Economies has shown me that groups and actors are often very strategic in how they utilize women to get around laws, to get around surveillance, to get around being caught. When armed groups find that there's a barrier from security forces, they'll often think about ways to utilize women in a way that they can get around these barriers. So if at checkpoints, militants find it really hard to cross checkpoints, and so often armed groups will get women to carry goods over checkpoints. People are aware of the fact that in monetary surveillance, men's accounts and men who are perceived as at risk are often checked more. And so they'll use women's accounts. They'll use female-owned businesses. So actors have utilized the fact that women are not suspected. People don't think that women can get up to crime, can get up to corruption. They're often not suspected. And actors often utilize that. I'm assuming the same would apply in the corruption world, where there's an opportunity to get around rules, people do. And so I think the thing which I would recommend in everything is look out for the woman. Just because it's not a gendered area, don't look for the gendered piece. In the beginning of any corruption work, the first step must be to do a proper analysis of where are women coming into this? Are women actors? How are women negatively affected by this? How are women affected by the actions of government actors and of police, law enforcement actors? In every type of programming, that sort of gendered analysis must play a fundamental part of the implementation of programming.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Orly. Any question? Yeah. So just for our online audience here, the question was the implications of the legalization of some of the commodities for drug economies. Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, a really good question. And I mean, the debates on legalization and decriminalization and have really been driven by northern concerns about drug use in Western countries. And what hasn't been sufficiently considered is what impact, if you know, it will never happen, but what if overnight heroin, cocaine became legal, and in countries, you know, so there's a lot of illegal peasantries around the world. A lot of people living who depend upon the market that criminalization provides in order to survive and keep a foothold on the land. So if it was happening overnight, it would have devastating impacts on the economies and of a very big proportion of kind of agrarian communities around the world. So you need to think really, really carefully about those implications. Now, there have been interesting experiments, as we know, in cannabis legalization in Africa as well, and we've been, colleagues at Bristol have been doing interesting research on that. And surprising, they found there's a similar process to the corporate capture that you see in parts of the US with legalization, that this new opening up of this new market, it's being captured by the big players, and that's been happening in South Africa as far as I'm aware. So I think this is, you know, it's something that that hasn't really been thought through, and kind of there are real transition costs to that kind of a process. It goes back to my point about who bears the costs of that, and usually it's those on the margins. But yeah.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back. Yep.
So I sort of related to some of the questions that were coming up, but you mentioned that Al-Shabaab was able to provide a more stable service, and their roadblocks, so they're seen as more touristy. And I'm curious as to how, especially coming on to the comments about how people aren't joining them for ideological reasons or joining them for economic reasons, how they manage corruption within their ranks, given that, you know, roadblocks, the individuals at roadblocks have a lot of power in the moment over the person. So how are they able to provide that more stable? Is it just violence?
Yeah, you know, so it's a really interesting question. There's been some really great work, again, from GTalk, Accept, I think, has several really good studies looking at the politics around roadblocks in Somalia. I mean, I think there's a couple of levels to it. Fundamentally, the roadblock system that they've got set up works on a sort of receipt system where, you know, you show it to one checkpoint, next one down the line, next one down the line, you only get charged at one, and then you're just allowed to pass through the others, whereas there's, you know, very limited, if any, systematic sort of approach between different clan militias or Somali police, Somali army. In terms of enforcement, I think it's sort of contested, I guess. I mean, to a degree, I guess you have those sort of diehards who are, you know, aligned to the ideological project, although they are probably less likely to be the guys manning the, you know, the individual checkpoints. You have a very rigid audit system within Shabab managed by the Amniyat and its sort of internal intelligence services. So again, GTalk has a great report looking at Shabab's tax machine, sort of running through how often these tax collectors are essentially audited, prosecuted internally, sporadically, but occasionally. And again, you know, there's that sort of performative violence element of it. But yeah, I mean, it's clearly an imperfect system. It's not to sort of say that you know, the mechanics of it actually work seamlessly. They absolutely don't. It's a very imperfect system. Setting aside the violence and the coercion and everything else, I mean, the actual way it runs is, you know, it's not by any sort of good standard efficient or effective, but compared to what else is available, that's when, you know, I think you've got that sort of contrast that haulers and truckers and drivers generally tend to opt for. But yeah, I'm happy to point you in direction of a couple of really good studies on this. But yeah, I don't know, Orly, if you've got any additional thoughts.
I mean, a small thought, which is to say, like, the levels of fear in Al-Shabaab territory of Al-Shabaab are so immense. Like, people don't cross the group easily because the consequences are often so harsh. So, you know, like, person after person that I spoke to was just really emphasized that, like, people on Al-Shabaab territory are terrified of the group, who are seen as being, like, all-powerful, as having ears everywhere, of finding out everything. Their network of informers kind of spans the territory and is highly effective. And so I think there's like a carrot and a stick. Militant fighters in the group are treated relatively well, or militants in the group, but there's also the stick of, like, if you cross the group, the ramifications are fast and hard and very, very serious.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you want to add anything on this one?
I think it's interesting that the kinds of conversations that we're having here, they so much of that applies to discussions around the Taliban in Afghanistan. You know, and people are happy that they don't have so many checkpoints now.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not saying that they're all people are happy with the Taliban, but they are happy that they don't have to pay multiple taxes, and it's predictable. They know, you know, it's transparent, it's predictable. So there is something there about states and non-states and questions of legitimacy and how taxation feeds into that.
Thank you. I'm just going to field one question from our online audience. Milga Liban had 2 questions, one of them on Somalia, which I think we'll park since we just discussed it now. The second one, Orly, was more for you. How do we move away from generalizations with gender? The focus for donors and others is often on masculinities and women, but how do we look at other identity factors or demographics beyond a somewhat binary look at women, men?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question, and it's utterly unexplored in the research. I mean, it feels to me like even just women, like remembering to think about women in these topics is novel. Certainly the research has not spanned, not that I've come across, spanned other aspects of gender identity. I mean, I think it's really an important moment where I do think that amongst donors and practitioners there's this real moment of understanding the importance of gender, making gender issues front and center of all of these projects, making gender analysis at the start of projects mandatory, and again there's been this really important moment of remembering to look at masculinities and at the dual parts that masculinities can play, how they fuel men to do productive things and incredibly unproductive things. And so I think it's been an amazing moment for gender scholarship and gender practice. I've in my 15 years in this field, I've not seen anything like the last few years in terms of gender being highlighted, but we have not gotten far at all in looking at other aspects of gender identity in this area of work. And I think that that's really an important next step for this work.
Anything from our other fellow panelists on this question? No. Just a question from the audience. So the question for our online audience related to the interconnectivity between the climate crisis and war economies. Anybody would like a first stab at it?
It's not something that I've looked at. I can take a guess if you like, but do any of you have?
I have I mean, do you want to start?
No, you go ahead.
I mean, the short answer is I personally haven't done research on this, although we have someone in our team who's trying to develop proposals around the drug economy in Colombia and, you know, land grabbing and deforestation. Now, what that's you know, there are kind of obviously complicated sets of links between climate change and illicit economies. But it's more complicated than coca cultivation leading to deforestation. Other parts of the economy, ranching, for example, mining, are far more destructive than the coca economy. I mean, so it seems that as a lot of the areas affected, the borderland regions where there are illicit economies going on, are also disproportionately affected by climate change, so this is a kind of something that's, I think, is going to be, there's a whole area of research that I think needs to be done here around those kind of intersections and the nexus between illicit economies, borderland regions, and climate change. But it really, I think very little has been done in that respect now.
Should I?
Do you want to say a couple of?
I mean, it's tangentially linked to this thing, but there was one of the chapters of my book was on resource extraction as part of War Economies, and about how women fit into this picture. And one of the things which was really interesting for me is I did a big case study on extraction in the DRC, in the eastern DRC. And mining towns are really interesting places where people flee to when there's shocks. So when there's violence in the communities, when armed actors come, when there's environmental problems, people flee, and they flee to mining towns often. Mining towns are perceived to be places of relative stability, of job opportunities in countrysides where there's no other job opportunities, of some level of governance, even if it's governance by armed actors. And so it's places where people flee. And when fleeing there, they often come into contact with war economy actors. And so, linking it back to climate change, I would imagine in the context of environmental degradation and of the job, the livelihoods problems that would arise from environmental events. This is the exact sort of thing that makes people flee homes, makes people go to centres where you often find war economy actors operating. So in the DRC, people flee to the DRC from shocks and land up at DRC's mines. I read a statistic that 98% of the mines in Eastern Congo have some involvement of armed actors, 98%. And so people flee the countryside for a range of different reasons. They find themselves working in these mines which are embroiled with armed actors. They service mining towns. You've got women who work in the hospitality industry and the sex industry in mining towns where they're servicing war economy actors. And so what you have is the situation where the population finds themselves in these sites with war economy actors because of shocks, degradation, environmental degradation happening in the countryside. And so that's just something to add to that.
Just a quick add on to that. I mean, I think there's a really interesting research project to be done, which is comparative work on frontier boomtowns, where you get these agglomerations of illegality, casinos, prostitution, drugs, illicit trade. They have a comparative advantage in illegality. But going back to the environment question, there is also Patrick Meehan, a colleague of ours, has been doing research on rare earth mining in Myanmar's Kachin borderlands. And I think there's an interesting thing to explore further, which they're doing, is about how the costs of the green transition, again, the impacts of this rare earth mining on the devastating the landscapes of Kachin state. So in order to meet these kind of transition goals, there are costs for people where the mining is actually taking place.
Just one final thing. Again, slightly tangential, but the other sort of obvious overlap with that, and it's something that we're quite keen to do more work on, is that sort of notion around rebel green governance. So again, sort of like linking war economies, climate change, and non-state armed group governance, how these things intersect, and whether or not that has implications for both climate and security priorities. So that's something that I think, colleagues are quite interested to unpack a bit more, but haven't done much on that front yet.
He's been waiting for a while.
So in the interest of time, because we only have about 5 minutes, I'm going to take a few questions. We had the lady in front who had a question, please.
Great. This is for Michael and Jonathan, I guess. I just want to say, you pointed out very beautifully, all of you, that war economies are not a single thing. They are themselves sort of divided into different categories that you can consider. And what I wanted to ask you, Michael, was that if you took the words Al-Shabaab and you took extortion and I think possibly Al-Qaeda franchise out of what you'd said, the same might apply to the Taliban, you took them out, how far is what you've described actually not law and order compared with possibly if you're and so my challenge here is to do with if one were to restate slightly change the language of one's findings here, to as it were, withdraw that element of violent extremists. You know, you're doing this, whereas actually most of what is being put on the table here, if you're an ordinary person, if you're a woman or a man and you are trying to make a life, and you've either got that checkpoint with the receipt, or you've got multiple ones and rape and all sorts of things, if the harshness that you know will happen to you is predictable, so you know what you do to create, you know, to suffer, how far would it change if we were to slightly change our language and consider that, you know, the benchmark, perhaps, for what we're looking for here is the experience of the people themselves.
Question from the gentleman at the back.
Oh, okay, thank you so much. So, very quickly, I would like to commend you for venturing into such a complex topic. Yeah. So, I mean, over my decades working within the law diplomatic corridors, quite frankly, I think I lost track of what is illicit wars economy and illicit wars in war economy. I'll give you an example. You have something called defense procurement. There is not a single war economy, be it licit or illicit, without the global arm manufacturing. It means time and time again in different places in Africa, different countries in Africa, we've seen legitimate government with less sophisticated weapons than the rebels. And in my experience of the diplomatic corridors, I can tell you that if there's any industry that is supposed to be highly regulated, is the arms industry. So you have about like 5 major countries that are produce all the weapons around the world. So when you find yourself, let's say in Mali, between Mali and Algeria, and then you find yourself with a lot of rebels groups that have the latest sophisticated weapons, some of them manufactured in 2022, and government don't even have access to those kind of weapons. So now my question is, how do you, I think we cannot decouple these wars economy with those who manufacture those weapons. So I would like to know your take on that.
Thank you. So just for our online audience, I'm going to try and summarize these 3 questions. The first one is related to how different would it be if we changed the languages to call these war economies actually law and order. Then the second question was about the difference between illicit and legal economies and the link between the procurement of weapons and war economies. And the third question by the gentleman was looking at the role of past governments in these countries affected by conflict. So if I could just give maybe a couple of minutes each to each panelist to try and respond either to one or all of these questions, going from, let's say, the order opposite to what we started with. So Michael, you would be first.
Just trying to remember back, yeah. So the law and order question, I think it is an interesting one, and obviously the genealogy, the history of Shabab ultimately started with the Union of Islamic Courts, and before that a collection of sort of neighborhood level Sharia courts that were designed essentially from the bottom up to respond to issues around insecurity, a lack of trust, governance gaps, security deficits, etc. So clearly that, you know, the mechanics of that governance project are speaking at least in part to people's needs and aspirations for security, stability, predictability, etc. I think where that departs quite radically is for a group like Shabab, a lot of that firstly is premised on extreme violence and brutality against not only the population as a whole, but very specific segments of that population, including women and minority groups. A lot of it is also cosmetic, ultimately. I mean, you know, a lot of this is Shabab propaganda, and in the absence of confidence in alternative security providers, households sort of, choosing somewhat rationally to go with, the group that ultimately is likely to have the most sway over your life on a day-to-day basis. Whether you're in a ostensibly government-held territory or Shabab territory, generally, the sort of calculus is that Shabab will ultimately be the dictating force in terms of your day-to-day experience. There is some really interesting academic work unpacking that relationship between not just sort of militant governance, but sort of Islamist governance more broadly. Aisha Ahmed's done some really interesting stuff looking at how groups like Shabab, but previously the Union of Islamic Courts, sort of lowered security costs and was able to develop quite interesting relationships with the local business sector, and how that then sort of metastasized into some of the forms of violence and insecurity we're seeing today. Obviously with the Taliban as well, that's another very interesting case study as to how far these forms of governance are actually able to accommodate or appease people's day-to-day needs. I think there's really interesting questions over the scalability of the model as well. And again, looking at the Taliban or potentially, some of the developments in Somalia over time, whether or not these incredibly violent, incredibly coercive governance models are able to scale up and sustain themselves at a national level, rather than just sort of little solutions to appease day-to-day community, problems. I think that will be a really interesting test for the sustainability, at least in the case of Afghanistan, over the Taliban's longevity. And already you're seeing you're seeing a whole myriad of different problems emerging or becoming much more exacerbated. I think they were always there, but it's becoming a lot more amplified. So yeah, I don't think it's just subbing out like for like in terms of removing certain words as you were suggesting, but the premise of the question I think is a good one, and certainly speaks to at least partly why Shabab is such a resilient force at a local level.
Orly, would you like to respond to some of the questions?
So there was a particular phrase that you used in your question which really got my attention, which was, if harshness is predictable, would it be better? And I think that's a really, really good framing of the question. I think what's important, though, as always, I wear my gender lens and my woman's hat. I think it's important to realize that different segments of a population are all going to see that very differently. So while the narrative may be that Al-Shabaab is a group that's traditionally had a lot of population support because things run better and there's less people taxing you, et cetera, there's definitely a segment of the population that's enjoying it less and is having a less good time of it. Same with the Taliban. Mention has been made of the fact that the Taliban has some population support for certain reasons, but certainly women are having a different experience of this. So I think always important when thinking about is something better is making sure that we're considering all people in that, we're considering minorities and the most vulnerable in society who often suffer from cruel regimes in the most acute way. To answer the two comments that came afterwards, absolutely, I completely agree with you about the arms trade. It hasn't really come up that much in today's discussion, but war economies are so political. As with conflict, as with geopolitics, it's all about the politics, and it's all about the stuff that we have deemed illegal versus the stuff that we've deemed legal. Some of that we've deemed certain trades illegal. We spoke about the drug trade, whereas other trades like the arms industry, which are significantly more harmful, arguably, we've deemed that legal because the powers that be are not going to take any steps to change that because they're powerful and the money and et cetera. So to your comment about former governments influencing all of this, absolutely, of course, these are such highly political areas where the actions of money and power and governments have very much shaped the situations that we see in these countries today.
So it seems like we have no solution.
Not really. Thank you. Jonathan, do you want to respond to some of the
questions? Because it's late, we're over time now, but the first one on the kind of law and order, I think, long ago, quite long ago, we've dispensed with the idea of kind of liberal peace building and good governance, and, getting to Denmark is, it has perverse effects if that's what the goal is. And so, thinking about these processes in a kind of a state building, a state formation lens, I think is really, really important. And there's actually a very good bit of research, you'll probably know, Michael, from the called the GovC program in the Danish Institute of International Studies. It's called Trade Makes States, and it's using that kind of lens to try and understand what's been happening in the Horn and how trade in some places is part of a process of state formation. It may not be, there's a brutal politics of sovereignty going on, and it's not like Denmark, but there is, we have to kind of think about these frames, more historic frames of reference, I think, to understand what's going on. On thank you for mentioning about the arms trade, and I think that the point that I was trying to make is that to understand war economies, they're not things out there, they're related to what's happening here, and our peace economies can be producing their war economies, and we're part of that process. And the only way to address war economies is not going to be about necessarily tinkering with what's happening in the borderlands of Somalia or Afghanistan. It's about thinking about our trade policies, who benefits from those kind of forms of instability. So it's a much more kind of radical kind of transformative agenda. But yeah, the other thing is, if you think about globally, investments in arms are skyrocketing. Investments in peace building, peace negotiations are going right down. So there's something going on here at the global level, which is not at all about addressing war economies.
Thank you very much to the panelists. I think it would be a detrimental exercise actually to try and summarize such a rich and nuanced discussion, so I'm not even going to try. It'll just be my role to thank all of you for coming here, for those online and their patience with our microphone issues and the call dropping off at some point. I hope they were still able to enjoy this. And I would like to invite those of you that are here to join us for a post-panel drink. I'm not entirely sure if our panelists will stay, but if they do, maybe it's another opportunity as well to ask any burning questions you may still have. So thank you very much all.